One final topic before we get to some calculations with titrations are the two different main types of titrations that are done. There are direct titrations and back titrations. A direct titration is what we've already done in class, in the lab, and is sort of what I've already been describing up to this point. We directly add titrant, our standard, to the analyte and observe the endpoint. And we can, of course, do a blank titration to correct for the difference between the endpoint and the equivalence point, and then we can use that to calculate the concentration of our analyte in our solution, which is really what we're after. All right, so we're just adding titrant to analyte directly. Now, our second type, a back titration, is a little bit different. So with a back titration, we add an excess of our standard to our analyte. So we add too much on purpose. And we measure exactly how much we add, but we know that it's too much. So I'll just say it's a known amount, but it's too much. The goal here is you want all of the analyte to react with your standard, and you want to make sure that reaction definitely happens, so you do that by adding an excess. All right, so we add an excess of our standard to an analyte. And then what we do is we use a second standard and titrate the excess of our first standard. Basically, you're trying to figure out how much of your standard that you added initially actually reacted with the analyte by measuring how much is left over. The analogy that's used in your textbook that I like is, imagine you're trying to figure out the cost of a candy bar. And for some reason, you don't know, you can't read the label or whatever. So you have a candy bar, and the way you can figure out how much it costs is by giving money to the cashier until the cashier, he or she, lets you take the candy bar and leave the store. So once you've given them enough money, that would be like the endpoint, right? And so to figure out how much it costs, a direct titration would be that you give, maybe 5 cents at a time. Give 5 cents to the cashier over and over until the candy bar is bought. So maybe it costs 75 cents. I give 5 cents and keep doing that until I've done it and I've gotten to 75 cents worth of money. A back titration in this analogy would be we give too much money on purpose. So maybe we give $1. We know $1 a candy bar will cost less than $1. We don't know how much less. So we give $1 to the cashier. Then figure out how much change we get. So in the example where the candy bar costs 75 cents, if we give the cashier $1, we notice that we get 25 cents back as our change. That tells us that the candy bar costs 75 cents because we know that we didn't get that back when the cashier gave us our money back. Now, why would we want to use a back titration? That's an important question here. We use back titration when sometimes the endpoint is difficult to observe. So with the first standard and the analyte, but the second endpoint where we have our second standard and our first standard is a very clear endpoint. We pick those on purpose, so it will be very clear. So you might have a difficult to observe endpoint. You might have a slow reaction, and so you add excess to make sure that it goes completely, and then you titrate, with a back titration. So those are some examples of why you might want to use a back titration instead of just doing a direct titration.